that's game over for the Palestinians, because we never really got a narrative from that side of the house as to how Palestine was ever meant to dig itself out of this hole. Apparently a state wouldn't empower them, but we ask, what would? Because from our side of the house we see a situation where a dispute has remained intractable for years, and the Palestinians remain disempowered with no clear way of ever being able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and get what they want. And what we say, and we agree with our own government, though we wish to extend upon that, is that the way you empower the Palestinians is by giving them a state. They might not get all of the advantages of the state, but they get real, tangible advantages that will allow them to put themselves in a relative position of strength and maybe 1 or 2 generations from now honestly negotiate for the very important and difficult things to get. So we're essentially going to extend on a whole suite of fronts of closing government. We're going to explain why Hamas will be disempowered by this policy and forced to get a more reconciliatory tone and walk alongside Qatar. We're going to explain why Israel is going to have to play nice, why it can't continue to remain bellicose in the face of mounting international pressure and the disempowering of the narratives their right wing relied on for so long to hold power. We're also going to talk about the advantages for Palestine. Why? No, they might not win every vote in the UN, but the access to all the institutions they can only have through statehood will give them real, tangible benefits, including things like economic growth, which will actually allow them eventually to play on a level playing field. But let's start with a couple of points for rebuttal I just want to clean up for the front half. This point about what the Palestinians want was never really that important, because Palestinians, yes, want a one-state solution, but they have a hierarchy of priorities, right? And we say for the average Palestinian, the overarching priority is to increase their quality of life. That's why they support Fatah when Fatah can give them social services. That's why they support Hamas when Hamas can give them social services. If we can improve, increase prosperity and quality of life for Palestinians, we think they've satisfied pretty much what they want. On the point of how useful the UN will be, we want to make the very obvious observation that statehood doesn't make you completely reliant on the UN for every single aspect of the benefits it gives. You can still negotiate with organisations like the WTO and the World Bank. You can still negotiate bilaterally with trade agreements and support agreements and mutual defence pacts. You can do a whole suite of things that don't rely on the UN. But the UN is also rules-based, right? It's political-based, but also rules-based, because lots of people have interests in the rules being respected, so that when they have a dispute, the rules are respected for them. So I think a lot of the time the United States will do things like abstain or disengage itself, rather than actually have a turf war with Europe about whether or not the United Nations should continue to be an active thing. Let's talk about the advantages for Palestine. It is important to recognise that this will create prosperity for the Palestinian people, because it gives them access to things that build their economy. Greater access to trade by being able to negotiate bilaterally as a state and rely on the protections of the WTO and other international organisations. Get aid that allows them to build institutions like courts that establish the rule of law and secure property rights. All of these things that can be slowly built up with access to the resources that ROG pointed out to, but actually very important. But here's the kicker. Building things like prosperity actually puts you in a position to more strongly negotiate for the very things that side of the house say they ultimately want. Because you can negotiate from a position of strength rather than a permanent position of weakness. Because you have independent wealth, that means you're no longer dependent on Israeli largesse to collect your taxes and deny you the bare necessities. And it also means there are other stakeholders who are interested in your continued prosperity. Because if you have bilateral trade, if you're part of international organisations, people care about you because you're on the world scene. And because people care about you, Israel cannot act with impunity without compromising the interests of those other stakeholders who share an interest in your continued future. Closing.
Statehood, equal access to the World Trade Organization and the World Bank, equal prosperity, equal miracles. Why would America, who controls those two institutions, have any incentive to assist Palestine in the construction of a state that threatens Israel, its strongest ally?
Well, the United States doesn't necessarily control those organisations and won't control them into the foreseeable future, right? Lots of countries that care about Palestine, like Europe, also have a lot of power in these organisations. And also, what about bilateralism? What about simply exchanging with people for goods and services to increase your prosperity, right? The UN is not this monolithic organisation that doles out prosperity to people, right? Lots of people with bellicose relationships with the United Nations continue to be prosperous simply by bilaterally trading and rely on the fact that people can't generally invade other states. No. Now let's talk about Israel. There's been a lot of talk about Israel as a sort of monolithic hate machine, right? That just tends to react to everything that happens by spazzing the hell out. We just don't think that's necessarily true. We think there are a spectrum of beliefs in Israel, as evidenced by their strong liberal streak and a whole bunch of other issues. But what's happened in the status quo is that the right wing has been able to establish narratives that give them power on the Palestine-Israel situation. They can say Palestine is a terrorist state, it's not an actual state, it's not legitimate, and no one cares about them. They can say that Palestine is dangerous to us. We can nip those narratives in the bud, firstly by crushing the idea that Israel's struggle is respected by the rest of the world, and also disempowering Hamas and things to continue to bellicose and belligerent. And so we think we can empower the left in Israel with a much more reconciliatory tone by saying that, look, the bellicose position of the right has not done what you wanted. It hasn't unempowered these Palestinians, it's actually empowered you. All this rhetoric that you've been using to maintain power has failed. We also think Israel is in fact more reliant on the United Nations and the United States not getting involved than they like to make out. They can't essentially fly solo if the United States refuses now to involve itself because it's scared of the backlash and simply abstains or refuses to get actively involved. We also think there are going to be benefits when Hamas moderates. Why do we think Hamas will moderate? Well, the thing is, we think Hamas operates on a sort of rhetorical and a social service delivery level, which helps empower it and empower its more bellicose rhetoric. And remember, if we can disempower Hamas and disempower their bellicose rhetoric, we necessarily disempower Israel's ability to continue to be bellicose itself. How do you disempower Hamas? Firstly, it loses its rhetoric that Fatah's diplomatic route has always failed. Because Hamas beats up on Fatah by saying, look, diplomacy fails, you're always rebuffed. Suddenly Fatah can say to people, look, we actually got this major international victory. Being bellicose and firing rockets has not achieved what we want. Actually negotiating on the international stage has done that. So they lose the rhetorical element. But they also lose their purpose, because one of the ways that Hamas secures influence is providing basic social services and security to its people. But Fatah, as the front organisation for Palestine as a state, can now be better placed to provide those services itself. It has access to more international resources like aid and trade, and also has a greater monopoly over the territory of Palestine. And so if people no longer have to rely on Hamas for their daily bread, that disempowers Hamas and makes people less likely to clandestinely support them in exchange for schools and hospitals that Hamas has tended to provide in the absence of a Fatah able to do so itself. So we disempower Hamas relative to Fatah and thus increase the ability of Fatah to promote more diplomatic solutions. And all of those are a good thing, and for those suite of reasons, we're proud to propose.